Hi, this is Sean Fenske. I'm editor of MPO and ODT magazines, and I am here with another episode of Mike on Medtech with regulatory guru Mike Drues, who is going to provide some insights today on some recently introduced guidances from the FDA, two specifically that speak to changes being made to medical devices, design changes, what requires additional reporting, what doesn't. So Mike's going to look to clarify these questions for us today. And Mike, let me first start by just thanking you for participating again in another episode of Mike on Medtech. And if you could just briefly share some of the key takeaways from these two new guidances from the FDA.
So first of all, Sean, thank you for the opportunity to be with you and your audience again. Always a pleasure to be here. The two guidances in particular that you're referring to were both issued last month in August of 2016, deciding when to submit a 510K for a change to an existing medical device. And the second is deciding when to submit a 510K for a software change to an existing medical device. We can provide links to both those guidances for your audiences as part of the podcast. But basically, these are two more in a series of guidances where, to FDA's credit, they're trying to give industry some suggestions on how to handle change in the medical device development process. As you know, Sean, one of the big differences between drugs and medical devices is that once a drug company comes out with a drug, for example, they're very, very hesitant to change it. As a matter of fact, they really don't change it at all. In the medical device world, it's quite different. Medical device development is very iterative. It's constantly changing. Medical device companies are constantly coming out with slightly different versions of existing medical devices. And so it's a very evolutionary thing. And as we'll talk about in our discussion in this podcast today, how we handle those changes, or alternatively, how we don't handle those changes, can really impact our success or the lack thereof with the FDA.
Great, and I look forward to getting into a little more of the details. Let me start by asking about software, which, as you know, can be an issue with device manufacturers, and many can be reluctant to make any changes, whether it be addressing a security issue or patching the software. Do these guidances address software specifically, or include it as the overall coverage of these guidances?
So that's a great question, Sean. Simply put, as I mentioned, one of the two new guidances does specifically address software. But that aside, really, I do not see any difference whatsoever in the approach to changing a medical device, whether you're changing the physical design or the materials or the manufacturing process, or in this particular case, the software that goes into it. The testing that we have to do is exactly the same in order to show that whatever those changes are, they're not going to impact safety, efficacy, performance, and so on of the device. Specifically with regard to software, one of the things that we always have to keep in mind is that if we make a change to one part of the software in one part of our system, for example, how do we make sure that that change is not going to have some unanticipated impact in some other part of the system that maybe we have never even imagined? But those issues, to be fair, are exactly the same when we change the design of a device or a material device. So the short answer to your question is yes, one of those two guidances specifically addresses software. And as you certainly know, Sean, more and more medical devices today are involving software components. But philosophically, from an engineering perspective, whether you change a physical device or the software, the approach, the logic, which we'll talk more about in a moment, is exactly the same to me.
Okay, that makes sense. How about an existing device? If a manufacturer has an existing device and they want to make a change or an alteration to it, is that something they need to report to the FDA, or what are the guidelines for that?
So that's a great question as well, Sean. The short answer is there is no simple yes or no question to that. In spite of the fact that FDA has issued not just these two recent guidances, but several guidances over the years in the general area of change control, there is no specific answer. At the end of the day, it's ultimately up to the discretion of the company. Some companies will be a little more proactive and go to the FDA prophylactically, even if they're not required to, and just let the FDA know as a matter of professional courtesy, here is the change that we're making to our device. Here is why we are making it. Here's the testing that we've done in order to show that it does not impact the safety, efficacy, performance, and so on of the device. In other cases, another company in exactly the same circumstances might decide not to take that information to the FDA prophylactically, because after all, why go looking for a problem where none exists, but instead still do that testing and keep it in-house, so to speak, as we'll talk about in a moment with a letter to file. So simply put, I wish I could give you and your audience a simple answer to that question, but there is no simple answer. One of the things that I've done recently, many of your audience are familiar with the pre-sub process. The pre-sub is often used, as the name implies, prior to the submission, pre-submission. But one of the things I've started to do now is I've created sort of my own post-sub meeting. And that is, I will go physically to the FDA and I will let them know as a matter of professional courtesy, hey, we've got this device, as you remember, already on the market, but I want to use this as an opportunity to let you know that we're in the process of making the following changes to the device, and here's why. Please notice I'm not asking for their permission. I'm not asking if there's anything else that I need to do. I'm simply going to them as a matter of professional courtesy. But at the same time, I'm also extending to them an opportunity to say, okay, Mike, that sounds great. Thank you for coming down and letting us know. Or I'll offer them the opportunity, okay, Mike, thank you for letting us know, but we have some questions. And now this is when the discussion begins. So that's a new version of the pre-sub process that I've started to use myself.
Great. Hopefully that's useful to viewers. Speaking about communication with the FDA, one of the things that seems to cause some confusion is communication methods and which to use when. So can you give a little insight into a letter to file versus a special 510K versus a PMA submission? Which one do you use for what case and when?
So that's a great question, Sean. And this is one of the most common questions that I've gotten in the nearly 25 years I've been playing this game. As you know, I work not just as a consultant for industry for many medical device companies, but I also work as a consultant for the FDA, as well as some of the other regulatory authorities around the globe. So I really see a lot of these issues from both sides. In terms of how to handle that information, letter to file versus special 510K or PMA supplement, I'll get to that in just a moment. But let me share with you the scenario that I really want to avoid, and I want your audience to avoid, and this is very important. I want to make sure that we don't have a scenario where we make a change to our device, and at some point in the future, a few months or a few years later, a knock comes on the door. It's the FDA. They basically say, hey, we noticed that you've changed your device. We don't remember you ever coming to talk to us about it. What the heck is going on here? I don't want to be in a situation where I have to say, oh, darn, I forgot, or worse, oh, gee, you caught me. That's not a good situation to be in. I want to be able to say, oh, Mr. or Mrs. FDA person, come on in, have a seat, sit down, have a cup of coffee. I don't know, Sean, are we still allowed to offer them a cup of coffee? I don't know. That's a different issue. But let me pull out my letter to file, for example, where I have all of the information in there. This is the change that we made. This is when we made it. This is why we made it. This is the testing that we did in order to show that that change does not impact the safety, efficacy, performance, and so on of the device. And oh, by the way, and this is icing on the cake if we can add this, if I can say that here are some of our competitors that have changed their device and have not told you either, that would be icing on the cake. All of this stuff is in there in our letter to file. I want to make it painfully obvious to my friends in the FDA that I'm a professional, that I know what I'm doing, that I haven't forgotten anything. It's just a matter at that point, I've made the business decision not to take this to the FDA in terms of a special 510K or perhaps a PMA supplement. The reason why that has always been my approach, Sean, long before these two new guidances, long before the original guidance came out in 1997, is because I want to avoid that scenario where you get that knock on the door and you have forgotten, or worse, something else. Because let me tell you, if companies don't handle this properly, and regrettably, many companies get into a lot of trouble because they do not handle this properly. In some cases, you might be finding yourself not simply dealing with the FDA, but also with the FBI. And let me tell you, if you think it's difficult to deal with the FDA, and the FDA can be a challenge, no doubt, they're nothing compared to the Justice Department. Those folks don't mess around. Now, fortunately, that does not happen often, but it has happened. And you and I both know that in some rare cases, people have actually gone to jail because they have not handled some of these situations properly. I'm not trying to scare anybody. I'm really not. I'm simply trying to emphasize that this is high stakes bingo. If at the end of the day, you do this as a letter to file, and FDA comes in and looks at your letter to file information, this is the worst case scenario that can happen. FDA can say, well, gee, thank you for sharing all this information with us. We think you should have submitted it to us prior to this as a special 510K or a PMA supplement. I say, fine, no problem. I will take all of that information from my letter to file. I will pull it into a new package. I'll call it a special 510K. You'll have it on your desk next week. Once again, I want to make it painfully obvious to my friends at the FDA that I do know what I'm doing, that I understand the advantages and disadvantages, and that it was simply a business decision. I'm not trying to hide anything. I certainly didn't forget anything. It was a business decision to keep this information internal and not to let them know about it.
That's great.
And by the way, Sean, if I can take it one step further, I'll add this. This is another recent practice I've now started to do in the last couple of years. More and more companies have asked me, well, how many letter of files can they do sequentially before now they have to go back to the FDA? Well, again, there is no answer to that question. This is, for those of you in your audience that are familiar with the 510K, this is analogous to predicate creep. So predicate creep, this is what I call letter to file creep. So here's what I like to do. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 letter to files that you have done on a device sequentially, what I like to do is I like to take all of them at some point and put them together and put them into what I call a catch-up 510K. Not catch-up in the hot ketchup and mustard sense of the word, but catch up in the sense of bringing this information to the FDA to get them up to speed on all of the changes that we've made over the last months or years to this particular device. I want to demonstrate to my friends at the FDA that I want to do this together. Yes, I'm the expert. I know what I'm doing, but I want to do this together. I value their opinion. I want their input, but I want to do this together.
All right, now you mentioned changes to the device. Does that only apply to design changes to the device itself, or is this relevant to the manufacturing processes as well?
It can be relevant to the manufacturing processes, Sean. This gets us into another of the many interesting regulatory differences between the 510K and the PMA. As some of your audience probably knows, in the PMA, there is a requirement to include your manufacturing information in your PMA submission. There is no similar requirement in the 510K, at least not yet. Although I can tell your audience that we have had discussions at the FDA about adding a manufacturing requirement to the 510K. I personally think it's probably a good idea because even in the 510K universe, the technology for our devices is becoming more and more complicated, and to separate the design of the device from the manufacturing process that we use to make the device, I think is a real mistake. But nonetheless, there is no manufacturing requirement yet in the 510K world. So for those of you in the audience that are working on PMAs, changes to a manufacturing process and a PMA probably are going to be needed to be reported to the agency. Changes to manufacturing processes in the 510K, although from a regulatory perspective, it might not be required to report them. Once again, depending on the nature of the change, I sometimes use that as an opportunity to let the FDA know prophylactically. Whether you do it as a 510K or just as a post-market pre-sub, it doesn't really matter. So the short answer is changes to your process, whether it's a 510K de novo or a PMA, changes to your process are covered under these guidances as well.
Good to know. Now, a lot of this sounds theoretical. You know, you're throwing a lot of not necessarily theory, but a lot of information at people. Might you have an example that you could provide that would really kind of illustrate all of this for the viewers?
So, Sean, I have lots and lots of examples I could share, but for the purposes of time together, I'll choose just one. And this, on the surface, sounds like a seemingly simple, almost trivial example, but I'll show you that it's really not. So several years ago, a catheter company came to me. They wanted to make what most people would consider a very minor change, perhaps a trivial change to their medical device. All they wanted to do was to move the company logo from one side of the hub of the catheter to the other. Because as it turned out, the way the cardiologist used this particular catheter, the company logo was pointing down, and therefore the marketing people were not happy because nobody could see their logo. So all they wanted to do was to move the logo from one side of the hub literally to the other. To most people, they would say, gee, this is a absolutely trivial change. Why bother doing anything? Why bother, letting the FDA know about this? Well, to me, the reason why so many companies get in trouble because they don't begin the process at the beginning. They answer the question they answer the question letter to file versus special 510K at the beginning. I think that question cannot be answered until the end. What we need to do is we need to do some analysis. We need to do some testing. I'm not talking about a PhD dissertation. I'm really not. But, pardon me, some minimal amount of analysis. Sometimes it can be done in a couple of weeks, sometimes in a couple of days, maybe even in a couple of hours. But we need some analysis, perhaps some testing, to show that whatever the change, even moving that logo from one side of the hub to the other, whatever the change, it will not impact the safety, efficacy, performance of the device. In that particular situation, to make a long story short, Sean, we found out because we did a little bit of testing, and not a lot, a little bit, we did find out that moving that logo from one side of the hub to the other did impact the way the cardiologist used that particular catheter, and as a result could have impacted the safety, efficacy, performance, and so on of the device, and therefore we did take it to the FDA. But if we didn't do any testing at the beginning, we would have never known that. We would have probably made that change anyway, and as a result, we could have gotten ourselves into a lot of trouble later on. We were able to avoid all of that by just a pretty minimal amount of work at the beginning, doing that analysis and that testing necessary to demonstrate first and foremost to ourselves whether or not that change had an impact on our device.
kind of making a great case for human factors testing as well with that example. So you spoke earlier about the implications of getting this wrong and whether or not to report a change. And you have FDA coming to knock at the door, and worst case, the FBI coming to knock at your door. With this confusion and misunderstanding by these device makers, is there a change or is there an implication to medical device development? Is innovation being impacted by these issues and by these challenges of knowing whether or not to submit a change or not?
Well, it's a very good question, Sean, and much to my regret, I have to say yes. I really think that this is hampering our industry in ways that most people don't even imagine. I started out, as you may remember, Sean, you and I have known each other for a long time. I started out in this business a long time ago, almost 25 years as an R&D engineer. And now I spend most of my time working in regulatory, but fundamentally, I still consider myself an R&D engineer. And here's why I mentioned that bit of my background to you. Because I work with several medical device companies now, including a couple of the largest medical device companies on earth, who have adopted as a matter of business policy. They have said as a company to their R&D engineering engineers in their R&D department, do not change, do not improve your device to the point that it would require us going back to the FDA. Only change our device in a very, very minimal way such that we can handle that change, as we talked about before, Sean, as a letter to file. Call me naive, and certainly many people do, but how can anybody argue that that is making the world a better place? I think that is really hindering the development of our future products. Now, to be fair, not all companies have that policy, but some do, and regrettably, a growing number of companies do. I think that we have evolved, and again, I'm stereotyping here, but many companies and many people in these companies have developed such a paranoia, and paranoia is a strong word, but I think it's an apropos word, a paranoia of the FDA that they want to avoid the FDA at all costs. I personally think that's a huge mistake. I have tremendous respect for the FDA, but I do not fear them. There's an important difference. One of my friends who used to be a senior reviewer at FDA was fond of saying, physicians can kill patients one at a time, but an FDA reviewer can kill patients thousands at a time. Quite frankly, that is something that more people in our industry need to remember. So I have a very healthy respect for the job of the FDA. And again, as a reminder to you, Sean, and your audience, I work as a consultant for the FDA, so I truly see these issues from both sides. I have a healthy respect for them, but I do not fear them. And I do not think we do a justice to any of us, our industry, our patients, or our society at large, when we use FDA as a convenient excuse to hold us back. I will be the first to say to a company, you tell me what makes sense from an engineering perspective and from a biology perspective. And if you can sell this to me from an engineering perspective and a biology perspective first, don't worry about the regulatory, don't worry about the FDA. I will sell it to them. We need to begin with the biology and the engineering first, and then let the regulatory follow. Unfortunately, Sean, at least in my experience of nearly 25 years of playing this game, that doesn't often happen that way. But that's my message to the industry. Have a respect for the FDA. They certainly have a difficult job to do. Here's another comparison that I sometimes make. The FDA and the CIA are very, very similar in the sense that when they both do their job, nobody knows about it. But when they don't do their job, everybody knows about it. So have a healthy respect for the FDA. That's a good thing. But do not fear them. Do not use them as an obstacle to hold you back.
It's a great message, and one that I think could go a long way in the industry, as I've heard similar stories from medical device professionals and who say that their company is reluctant at a certain point to, re-engage with the FDA on a product or on a design or whatever it is. Unfortunately, though, that's all we have time for in this this presentation of Mike on Medtech. Looking forward to doing the next one, and when we have that, it'll be posted up on mpomag.com. You can also watch through YouTube. But for Mike Drues, I'd just like to say thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you the next time during Mike on Medtech. Thanks again to Mike Drues for participating and providing his expertise, and we'll see you next time.